I think part of what I'm going to talk about is the answer to the question, what do we do while we're waiting for Henry George? He's taking a long time. I want to try to do something that sounds very porchy. I want to localize what I'm going to say and describe my neighborhood because I've been for the last year or two fairly focused on that, I think in a way that I've never really done before. I like to say that for my out-of-town friends, I like to say I live at the bottom of the lake. So if you think about the map, that's what I'm referring to. We're not really underwater quite. The bottom of Lake Michigan, in a kind of post-industrial landscape of mostly smaller cities and what are called Main Street towns. Main Street meaning less than 50,000. So the names are Gary, Hammond, Michigan City, Munster, Crown Point, Portage, and my town of Valparaiso. Valparaiso, by the way, is a kind of leafy exception in this mix. It's a little college town. It's fairly solidly middle class, and it's about 30 minutes from our own smaller version of Detroit, which of course would be Gary. It is a region I recently discovered which has been honored by a description from James Howard Kunstler. Just a brief one. He happened to travel through the area a couple of years ago, and he did a blog post, not about Valparaiso, because he actually came to my town, and he seemed to like it, and seemed to get that it was a kind of a stage set for the Music Man or something, you know, gingerbread kind of place. This is what he said about driving across Northwest Indiana, which many of you have just done, I realize, coming to this event. If you look out the windows, maybe this is something like what you saw. I call this mordant humor. In a place so desolate, it was hard to tell where everybody was going in such numbers on the endless four-laners. Between the ghostly remnants of factories stood a score of small cities and neighborhoods where the immigrants settled 5 generations ago. A lot of it was foreclosed and shuttered. There were places of such stunning, relentless dreariness that you felt depressed just imagining how depressed the remaining denizens of these endless blocks of rundown shoebox houses must feel. Judging from the frequency of taquerias in the 1950s vintage strip malls, one inferred that the old Eastern European population had lately been supplanted by a new wave of Mexicans. They had inherited an infrastructure for daily life that was utterly devoid of conscious artistry when it was new, and now had the special patina of supernatural rot that only comes from materials not found in nature, disintegrating in surprising and unexpected ways, sometimes even sublimely, like the sheen of an oil slick on water at a certain angle to the sun. There was a Chernobyl-like grandeur to it, as of the longed-for end of something enormous that hadn't worked out well. So, that's the backdrop. So, what kind of local economy works in this landscape? After a while, I realized that one easy answer we seem to be testing is casinos. Now we even have a candidate with a casino background, so this all seems to be moving in the same direction. I know that Richard Florida thinks that small cities like my neighbors are all going to fade away because they don't have enough of a creative class. Ed Glazer believes that we may be doomed unless we can simply become part of the mega region. We are certainly in the shadow of the city of Chicago, economic shadow. I have been interested in some new work that contrasts two different philosophies about placemaking and economic development. The more or less conventional one, and some of you will know about this, is called economic hunting. Economic hunting is where some very solid citizens and economic development people get together and scour the country looking for the next corporation that we can, in effect, offer so many bribes and goodies to that they will move to town and save us. It's interesting that this goes on at the state level with some success, but the recent research by the interesting people over at Ball State University says at the local and even at the regional level, economic hunting is pretty much a failure. There is no way to correlate the dollars, billions spent on this activity with any actual economic growth. The alternative, which I like because it's more within reach, is called economic gardening. And the short way to say that, I suppose, is that economic gardening is about tending to your own backyard, or more specifically, smaller businesses, which if you tend to them and encourage them and enable them, can grow up to be middle-sized employers and manufacturers. So we need a localist, sustainable approach, based on local resources. I thought it might be appropriate, particularly for this audience, since Wendell Berry is a kind of patron saint in the background, to just briefly read his rules for how you create a sustainable local economy, and this will touch on some of the same themes we just heard. Mr. Berry always says, first, you always ask of any proposed change or innovation, what will this do to our community? How will it affect our common wealth? Number two, he says, always include local nature, the land, the water, the air, the native creatures, within the membership of the community. Number three, always ask how local needs might be supplied from local sources, including the mutual help of neighbors, collegiate. Always supply local needs first, and only then think of exporting products, first to nearby cities and then to others. Understand the ultimate unsoundness of the industrial doctrine of, quote, labor saving, if that implies poor work, unemployment, or any kind of pollution or contamination. Develop properly scaled value-adding industries for local products to ensure that the community does not become merely a colony of national or global economy. Develop small-scale industries and businesses to support the local farm and or forest economy. Strive to supply as much of the community's own energy as possible. Strive to increase earnings in whatever form within the community for as long as possible before they are paid out. And make sure that the money paid into the local economy circulates within the community and decrease expenditures outside the community. And he has a few more. I think these are good, and I think they're beginning to some degree to seep into sort of a common understanding of the way we need to do this economic gardening. I also was reading a journalist talking about the economy of a different region, somewhat different region, which is Massachusetts. And this guy is arguing that one of the problems in Massachusetts has been the kind of hypnotic effect of Route 128. So his proposal is that we have too much focus on innovation. We need to drop it with the innovation and focus on unnovation. And his proposal is that means remembering the two traditional drivers of the northeastern economy, which were manufacturing and agriculture, so that there is a due given to these areas, that they not be left in kind of unglamorous decline. And it needs to be recognized that manufacturing, particularly the more automated and cutting-edge kind today, is clearly a very digital effort. Just as typically in farming today, you may see a young woman on a tractor holding her tablet. So in my own community, and in Indiana generally, we have the cultural memory, of course, of both of those activities, even though they've changed dramatically. But I think unnovation is a very interesting way to go. There's a woman named Catherine Tumber who has made the extraordinary statement but it is actually communities like mine in Northwest Indiana that are properly positioned for whatever is coming in this new economy. Her book is called Small, Gritty, and Green. And her argument is that in areas like mine and in certain other areas of the country, it is the small scale where you will find resilience and the ability of the community to respond to various kinds of stress. Secondly, the grittiness is the memory of some kind of industrial and manufacturing base. That it's not old knowledge workers. We have people who still culturally remember how to make things. And thirdly, if you're near like Michigan, if you're near farmland, you are in a kind of green position, which looks a lot better than, say, living in Phoenix or other possible sites around the country. So it's an interesting and provocative, counterintuitive kind of argument. Because some of us here persist in being either distributist or neo-distributist or some kind of crank like that, always explaining what the hell does this word mean. I wanted to describe for you a living, real community which very much resembles, I think in many ways, the ideal of us Porchers. This community, which as I say does exist, is low-rise and includes high-density development. It has a pedestrian orientation. It has a high use of bicycles and public transportation. It has mixed use, that is to say, homes are above the shops in many cases. The residences are thus close to the workplace. It has a kind of organic architecture, that is to say, it's evolving according to local needs. It utilizes collective action. It is somewhat organized in terms of the way citizens interact together. It has fairly intricate networks of solidarity, a kind of informal social safety net, and it has vibrant cultural production within the community. So you might be surprised that what I'm describing is at least a some number, of the favelas in Brazil. I was in Brazil about 3 years ago, and I didn't spend a long time there, but I took a tour of some of these areas of the city. And I discovered they were not like anything else in my experience. For example, they did not resemble the west side of Chicago. They were much more like self-generated, self-sustaining, highly anarchic communities where essentially the governing powers, for the most part, had always been completely oblivious to most of what was going on there until finally, issues of crime and infrastructure and other things began to encroach. But I'm interested in the idea of a kind of favela economics because it turns out that while a Georgian approach is a very important and, so to say, key model in kind of conventional legal framework, favela economics is about squatter land, and it's about a different kind of dynamic in the society, which is much more like the sort of benign version of anarchism as a political philosophy. So that I'm sure will generate some controversy. I want to wind up by saying, like all of you here, I am closely observing what's going on with Rod Dreher and the Benedict option and where that is going. You might suspect from my interest in my description that friends created a blog, several of us together, called the Dorothy option. Dorothy referring to Dorothy Day. And the idea that our focus will not be so much on a kind of an internal community for what's coming, but rather a way of engaging, a new way of engaging in the community that is very much focused on a favela-like sense of reality. I also think that what else is coming and what is interesting, part of the news, is that there is emerging, and has been emerging over the last couple of decades, a new kind of economy of sharing, communion, participation that has nothing to do with Airbnb and Uber, which some of our friends at Solidarity Hall critique, I think rightly, as being really just another version of the Silicon Valley scheme to extract value from one place and move it into the pockets of the people organizing the company. But there have been, as I say, movements toward an economy of communion, you could call it, for some time. And in our current political conversation, these things really never come up. Movements toward cooperativism, or indeed a movement like that one sponsored by the Focolare movement, to go back to faith-based thoughts. Focolare, which has been around about 50 years, started up in the early 50s, a network of small businesses with an intensely personalistic focus, also with a kind of cooperativist outlook. They're now at somewhere around 700, 800 businesses. I'm running scared. 800 businesses worldwide. Granted, most of them somewhat smaller, but they are clearly not only a remarkable model of the way in which a new economy can be organized, they are literally a footnote in a papal encyclical. They're the only business organization I know of ever footnoted in a papal encyclical, which is Caritas in Veritate. And they are a remarkable experiment, I think, pointing in the right direction. So part of my hope with my kind of localist experiments is that without waiting for any news from Washington, we can, in our own backyards, do some economic gardening and see if that doesn't help matters along.